Okay, so today's focus is on passing genes to the next generation. We're going to spend both today and tomorrow talking about this concept. I've actually broken it into two distinct different sections that are actually going to complement each other quite well. So here's today's plan. We're going to investigate the ways that living organisms pass on their genetic information to their offspring. The first one we're going to look at today is asexual reproduction. This is going to cover things like binary fission, budding, spore production, and vegetative reproduction. Some of those things are probably things you've heard of before. We're going to talk about how those mechanisms work, as well as why certain organisms do those things. Tomorrow, we're going to focus on sexual reproduction. That's going to be in plants, animals, and bacteria. We're going to take, of course, a scientific approach to this. We're going to talk about both of these, asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction, from a focus of how genetic information is being passed on. We're not going to go into great detail on these things, of course. We're just going to talk about how these are different methods that organisms can use to pass on genetic information. So again, though, we're only going to focus on asexual reproduction for today. Before we get started with anything, though, let me just remind you guys right now, please check your email every single day, please. It's an expectation right now that teachers are reaching out to their students 3 times a week just to check in on them. I've heard back from most of you guys, but there are a few of you who have not checked your emails yet. Please just check your email, find the email that says something along the lines of, I think it was Science 9 check-in or something, and respond to it, please. Even if the response is just a, okay, yeah, I'm getting this, I'm fine. That's all I need, okay? From now on, you need to be checking your email every single day so that you can see when I'm sending these out. Anyway, I'll stop blathering on about that right now. Let's move on. So before we begin, I just want to start with a quick reminder about Punnett Squares. This is what we did on Friday last week, as well as what you would have done on Monday. I'm gonna give you an example, just to say why these are kind of useful. What's one kind of interesting, novel way that we haven't seen these used before, right? So here's an example. My parents both have brown eyes, both my mom and my dad. It's a true fact. Now I also have brown eyes, as does my brother. But my sister, on the other hand, she has blue eyes. So how is that possible? Even though my parents both have brown eyes, how is it possible that my sister has blue eyes? So another question, another way to word this would be, what must our genotypes be? And remember, a genotype is what actually shows up in your gene expression of the alleles. So for example, a genotype might be capital B, 2 dominant brown eye genes, right? That would be a genotype. So first of all, let's start with my sister. She's the outlier here. She has blue eyes. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put her in this Punnett square, but I'm going to put her in a very specific location, and you'll see why I do this in a moment. I'm going to put my sister, who has blue eyes, blue, remember, is recessive, down in this bottom right-hand corner. So I'm going to say lowercase b, and I'll just put in brackets just so you know that's my sister, right? Now, that is the only way that she would have blue eyes, if she got a blue eye allele from both of my parents. So if we say my mom is up here and my dad is over on the side here, this spot on the Punnett square would correlate to getting a lowercase b here and a lowercase b here. So notice already, just from understanding that my sister has blue eyes, we have now determined that my parents both must be carrying a blue eye allele, both my mom and my dad, right? Now, I told you before, both my parents, however, have brown eyes. Brown, of course, is a dominant trait, so they must be carrying, obviously, that dominant brown eye gene, or allele, I should say. So in other words, for my mom and my dad, I'm going to give them a capital B right here. Now that we know what the genotype is, so the genotype of both my parents is capital B, lowercase b, now that we know their genotype, we can now fill in the rest of this Punnett square. So this top left-hand box, capital B, this box over here, capital B, lowercase b, and this box down here, a capital B and a lowercase b. We always write the capital letters first if they ever show up in here. It's not that you have to write your mom's allele or your dad's allele first. You just write the capital one first. I don't think I ever explained that to you guys. Now anyway, this Punnett square would actually represent the Punnett square for my parents' offspring, right? So in other words, myself and my siblings. My sister right here has blue eyes. Between my brother and I, we must fall in any of these 3 boxes here, right? So unfortunately, because my brother and I both have brown eyes, we won't know for sure which ones of these spots on the Punnett Square, so in other words, which genes we would have. Now, my brother actually does have 2 kids, and both of his kids have brown eyes. So perhaps he could be this double BB, right? And then that would make a 100% possibility that his kids would have brown eyes. But he could also be one of these ones, and he just, didn't have a kid with blue eyes. It's pretty much impossible to determine for sure, unless, of course, you're like my parents, who would have also not known that they were capital B, lowercase b, until they had kids, right? So kind of an interesting application of this. Notice how this case, we kind of started with some stuff in the Punnett Square and then we worked backwards. So some interesting things that come out of analyzing both myself and my siblings is that my parents must both carry a blue eye gene, which is pretty cool. Anyway, so for today's topic, passing on genetic information. Living organisms pass their genetic information from one generation to the next. This is done to preserve the genetic traits of the parents and further the survival of the species as a whole. Not a big surprise there. Organisms have children so that the organism species can continue to live. Now, since the genetic information of a parent is passed to the offspring will have traits that are similar to those of either or both of their parents. Also not a big surprise here. I absolutely love this picture. This picture showed up on the internet not too long ago, actually. In case you're not aware who this is on the left here, this is Steve Irwin. Steve Irwin had a TV show, I guess you'd say in the late 90s and early 2000s. I watched it a lot when I was growing up. It was called Crocodile Hunter, and he was always going around and finding really cool animals and talking about their adaptations and how they live in their environments and how they can be deadly and dangerous. Like, of course, crocodiles, the name of the show, Crocodile Hunter, that was always on there. But really, really fascinating guy. But unfortunately, in I think it was the year 2006, he passed away. He was actually tragically killed, of all things, by a stingray. It was horrible, horrible news. I remember I was absolutely heartbroken from that because I was a big fan of Steve Irwin. I was in high school when this happened, so even though I was older, it still was quite like a shock to me. But this picture here on the right fascinates me because this was taken not too long ago. This is his son, Robert Irwin. And it's remarkable because I believe this crocodile is actually the same crocodile from both pictures, right? So in other words, even though this picture is about 20 or so years later, it's the same crocodile. And it's a remarkable similarity between Steve and, of course, his son, Robert. And that comes back to this idea that traits are passed from a parent to an offspring. So he has a very clear resemblance. Obviously, the clothing is one thing, the fact that he's interacting with a crocodile, but those are non-heritable characteristics. But even just his appearance, right? He carries a lot of the traits of his father, as, of course, children often do. So different organisms pass their genetic information on in different ways, right? Asexual reproduction is where only one individual parent is passing on genetic information. This means that the offspring are identical to the parent. The offspring is sometimes referred to as being a clone, right? Asexual reproduction is where one parent basically clones themselves. That's as simple as we can put that one. Now, sexual reproduction, on the other hand, is where two parents contribute genetic information to their offspring. We're not going to talk about that one today. That's going to be left for tomorrow. Again, even when we go talk about it tomorrow, we're not going to go into like great detail, don't worry. We're just going to talk about how genes combine and get passed on to an offspring. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those. We're only going to focus on asexual reproduction today, so we're really going to build an advantages and disadvantage table at a later time. But for now, we'll just focus on what asexual reproduction is today. So asexual reproduction, there are 4 main types of asexual reproduction that we're going to investigate. There's more than just 4 types, but there's only 4 that we're going to investigate as per this course, just to make that clear. The 4 types we're going to look at are binary fission. That probably means very little to you right now, but maybe not. Maybe you heard of that before. Budding, that might also not be familiar to you right now. Spore production, you probably could take a really good guess what that one is. And vegetative reproduction. Probably a lot of you know what that one is as well, but if you don't, hey, that's why we're here. We're going to learn, right? Now, while the examples we'll look at deal with single cellular organisms, plants, and fungi, there have been documented cases of some animals reproducing asexually on their own as well. This is pretty rare when it comes to animals. There's very few examples, but some of these examples surprise even me. A female hammerhead shark was documented cloning itself in 2007. This was pretty much unprecedented, and from what I understand, about this was it was a hammerhead shark that was actually in captivity. I don't know if it was in an aquarium or if it was in some sort of lab or where they had it, but it was in captivity and there were no male hammerhead sharks around. But they still found that the female hammerhead shark was able to have children. And then once they identified, of course, the genetic traits of those offspring hammerhead sharks, they did notice that it was genetically identical to that mother hammerhead shark, which is phenomenal. That's incredible. So in other words, it's an adaptation that this hammerhead shark had, that it was actually able to produce offspring without any other males present. So of course, it's in an extreme situation. There really isn't a lot of animals that can do this. It's not very well understood. I believe the name of that process is called parthenogenesis. I could be mistaken on that. You don't need to know that though, but it is kind of like a, oh wow, like that's something that can happen. Really, really, really weird. You know, you would never expect that. All right, so first one, binary fission. Binary fission occurs in unicellular organisms. In other words, single-celled organisms, organisms that only have one cell, right? Now, how it works is the cell splits in two, producing identical offspring. You're going to go into really, really great detail in binary fission when you're in Science 10. But for now, we only just need to know basically that it exists and that it occurs in unicellular organisms, right? So for some examples, it happens in bacteria and protists. Protists, of course, are single cellular organisms that have a nucleus of their own, right? So a lot of like unicellular organisms would be protists, whereas bacteria don't have a nucleus of their own. So there's a little bit of a distinction there. You don't need to know that either. Just understand that it occurs in single cellular organisms. Picture on the right, we'll say first, shows the actual process. Again, it's very simplified, of course, but inside the cell, there's things called chromosomes. Chromosomes, of course, get replicated, so they make an extra copy of them. And then that's when the cell decides to start splitting in two, where each section gets a copy of that chromosome, and therefore that DNA is shared between those two. So these two new single cellular organisms are identical copies to one another. They have the exact same DNA. They are clones, right? This animated picture here on the left is kind of cool. It's showing just the process by which this happens. It is quite slow. It is quite an arduous process. I wish this was maybe like sped up or something so that you could see it totally split apart. But notice that two different cells are forming from one. So this is kind of just starting to split this way. It's on like a long way rather than like this clump way that this picture is showing. Different single cellular organisms will do it in different ways. Anyway, moving on. Budding is the next one. Budding is where a parent produces a small attached identical version of itself. Now by identical, we really should say genetically identical version of itself. Now the offspring can stay connected or it can be detached, right? So in other words, once it comes up, maybe it'll detach off, fall into the ground or wherever, and then form a new plant altogether. So for some examples, coral does this, yeast, certain types of cacti do this, sea sponges, as well as a very strange, extremely tiny animal called a hydra. That's what this picture is right here. Basically how a hydra works is like little different buds kind of form off the side of it, and then they break off and they can form new ones that just appear around it, right? This actually is an animal. Kind of surprised me. I thought it was going to be like a plant or something, but it technically is an animal. It's kind of like a jellyfish in a way, I suppose you could say. Like a very bizarre animal that you wouldn't really ever think of, right? Another interesting thing about hydra, I know this has nothing to do with asexual reproduction, but hydra are actually one of the very few animals that are biologically immortal. In other words, they do not age. They theoretically could live forever. Of course, that doesn't always happen. Things could kill it or whatever, but biologically speaking, it doesn't age. The more you know, right? So again, sea sponges, coral, and cacti, they can reproduce by budding as well. So this picture of, I believe that's a sea sponge. Maybe it's, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a sea sponge. You can quite clearly see that all of these like little arms growing off of it, those are the buds, right? So a bud could perhaps slash off, float somewhere else, and then stick to a new object where it then grows a new bundle of sea sponges, right? Cacti work kind of in a similar way. Each of these different, like, I don't even know what you'd call that, different leaves of the cactus. I don't know. But anyway, those different parts of the cactus, those are the buds, right? So in other words, those are genetically identical copies of the cactus itself. Moving on. Spore production. This one, many of you probably have heard of this one before, but we'll go over it anyway. And if you haven't, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Spores are used by fungi to reproduce. They behave in a similar way to seeds in that a new fungus grows where the spore lands, as long as nutrients are present. So as long as there's, nutrients present on the substrate, remember that word substrate back from earlier this year, the substrate is the thing that it's growing on. As long as nutrients are existing there, a new fungus is going to flourish and grow. Now that new fungus, again, I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but it's genetically identical to the parent. That's the whole idea behind this. All of these methods are asexual reproduction methods where the parent basically clones itself. I really like this picture. I wonder how they even took it. Like, I like it with the black background. I wonder if this was in a lab or something. But it's showing some sort of fungus that's actually shooting its spores up into like a cloud, and then that cloud's going to come back down and grow new fungus. On bread, of course, the mold that forms, the reason that mold spreads from like a central location is because spores are being emitted from that mold, right? That's why also if you have, let's say, a fresh loaf of bread and you store it near a not so fresh loaf of bread that goes moldy, even though that fresh loaf of bread might be very new, it's going to get moldy pretty quick just by being near it. And that's because those spores can attach to that fresh loaf of bread immediately. Or rather, with the old loaf of bread, of course, they had a long time to develop. The last one we're going to look at here is vegetative reproduction. This occurs in some species of plants, and it works kind of like budding. Like, it's almost the same kind of thing. A part of the parent plant breaks off and can grow as a new genetically identical plant. That might seem very vague, very large, especially where it says just a part of it, but that's because vegetative reproduction can be many different parts of a plant. There are 3 types you could look at. You don't have to know each one of these, of course. It'd be nice to know some of the examples of different plants that do this, but the actual names here you don't need to know. But one of the names, of course, are a runner. Runners have stems with new buds on them, kind of like strawberry plants. And in case you're not aware how that works, there's like a stem. I'll just draw on the picture here. There's like a stem that grows over the surface and then finds a new spot in the soil to kind of plant itself, and then a new genetically identical plant grows. So strawberries work much like this. Of course, you can imagine why they're called runners. They're running along the ground. Really creative, I know. Tuber is the next kind. Tuber are bulbs on a root that grow a new plant. Easiest example of a tuber, in my opinion, is a potato, right? If you're not aware how potatoes grow, the potato plant, of course, itself looks like this, and the potatoes grow underneath the ground. If you leave potatoes too long, they start getting those weird root things going on with them. Well, that's because it's actually trying to grow a new potato plant, right? The potato themselves are called a tuber, and a tuber is just a way of vegetative reproduction, and it's done asexually. It is done on its own. So all the other potato plants that grow from those tubers are genetically identical to the parent, right? It's just a clone. Now, the last kind is called a sucker. A sucker is a new stem that grows from the side of a plant stem, kind of like tomato plants. And I'll be totally honest with this. I've never tried this. I didn't know this before I started teaching this course, but with tomato plants, apparently, some of the part of the plant stem is called a sucker. And if you were actually to detach that and plant that piece of it, it would grow a new tomato plant. The more you know, right? These other ones I did know, of course. Growing up, we did have potato plants a lot, so you could just replant a lot of the tubers, the actual potatoes itself, and a new one would grow. But I didn't know that about tomato plants. So again, there you go. Those are vegetative reproduction strategies. Now, of course, before I move on, I want to really make it clear, not all plants do this, okay? It only occurs in some species of plants. And even in the plants that do this, they can also reproduce sexually. In other words, they can actually combine their genetic information with another plant. But we'll leave that for tomorrow as well. So for practice today, a little bit of a deviation from what we usually do. We don't have textbook questions for this because the textbook questions for this section cover both asexual and sexual, and we haven't gotten there yet. So I'm not doing those quite yet. So instead, what I want us to do, and I don't want you to spend more than about 15 or so minutes on this, make an asexual reproduction study guide. So take a piece of white or lined paper and divide it into 4 sections. I'll show you what I mean in just a second here. In the 4 sections, I want you to list the names of the 4 asexual reproduction methods that we've covered. I want you to give a definition of each method in your own words. So in other words, paraphrase it for me. Just tell me what, like, another definition of how it would work. You can refer back to this video, but please put it in your own words. I want to see what you understand from this. And then last but not least, draw a picture of one example. of each method, right? You don't have to be super artistic here. Do what you can. I would like to see some color if you have any pencil crayons or whatever at home. If you don't, though, that is optional. It's up to you on that one. Now, to hand this in to me, so to say, I want you to upload a photo of that study guide once you've completed it to Google Classroom under the assignment heading Asexual Reproduction Study Guide. And this, of course, is going to be made available to you first thing Tuesday morning, so chances are it's already past that. It should be up there right now. Just by the way, if you're uploading a photo, you'll probably take that with a phone. And if you're taking a picture with a phone, it's going to be a lot easier if you use the Google Classroom app on your phone to hand this in, right? So in other words, rather than having to upload a picture from your phone to your computer and then upload the picture from your computer to Google Classroom, that would just be a whole mess, but whatever, right? So if you have the Google Classroom app on your phone, you can just upload it directly that way. I want you to submit this assignment no later than Wednesday night. Okay, so in other words, you have Tuesday, of course, to hand it in. That would be ideal. But if you need just a little bit of extra time, I'll let you hand it in on Wednesday as well. I wouldn't recommend handing it in on Wednesday because you are going to have some textbook questions to work on Wednesday. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, for an example with this, the study guide, of course, just take a piece of white paper. We'll say that this is your white paper and break it into the 4 different sections. So one of the 4 sections we looked at was, of course, binary fission. Right? Give me a definition in your own words, and then draw some sort of a picture, okay? And do that for the other 3 as well. Now, to submit this, I also took this picture right here. I got it right off of Google's website. This is how you hand things in. On the sidebar in where the assignment is, there should be a little box that looks like this. There's a button that says plus, add, or create. If you click it, it brings down this menu. If you're going to upload a picture, you're going to want to click on where it says file. Okay, and then find your picture, upload it that way. And then I think once you do this, there's a blue button underneath here. You can kind of see like this menu's kind of obscuring it. But I think the blue button says something like turn in or hand in or something like that. Please click that as well. I think I can access it even if you don't press it, but I think it would make things better because then I can see who's really handed this in and who hasn't. Again, this is not for marks, but I do expect that you hand this in. This is not an optional thing. I will be phoning home if you don't do that. So your work's cut out for you. Anyway, if you have any questions, please send me an email. Talk to you again soon.